Mully here. So last time I left you, we had just arrived in Greymouth. We camped out at a place just south of town called Carter's Beach, and then we headed our way down
the beautiful west coast to Lake Mahinapua. The entrance to the lake was like cycling through a tunnel of prehistoric rainforest. It all felt very Jurassic Park. The lake itself was great, and while the weather wasn't too good, I managed to make friends with a curious Weka. It rained hard overnight, and we soon realised that our tent poles were so bent from all of the use that the middle of the roof had collected all of the rain. The material sagged and we started to get wet. We found the next morning that the ground sheet had also started to let water in. With everything a little bit wet, we left to meet up with Jason and Emily, who had met in Napier. We had spent a day with them whilst in Nelson and arranged to stay with them whilst they were house-sitting in a place called Kakapotahi. The house they were looking after was awesome, just the kind of place I'd be happy to live in. Jason and Emily, thank you again for letting us stay the night. We had a great time catching up with you, and we hope to see you again soon. Next we had a quick stop at Harry, where we started to come into the Southern Alps and the landscape began to change. By the time we arrived in Franz Josef, the mountain ranges were in full force. We took a walk up to the glacier, which was pretty cool. Unfortunately, we could only walk up to 750 metres away from the start of the glacier. Any closer would have to fork out $500 each for a helicopter to take us up. We left Franz Josef to head to Fox. Although not a long ride, 3 big hills stood in our way. I made it to the top of the first hill, with my heart thumping in my chest and my lungs screaming. Luckily, a lady in a truck with an extra trailer on the back pulled up and offered us a lift over the next 2. We gladly accepted the offer and arrived in Fox. We found out later that those 3 hills had been nicknamed the Triple Heart Bypass, and after the first I could see why. Arriving in Fox so early, we decided to cycle down to Lake Matheson, which was well worth it. Walking around the lake, we had views of the Alps and of Mount Cook. We also took a walk up to Fox Glacier. Though not as pretty as Franz, I still kind of preferred it. We could get up to 250 metres away, and you could see the river flowing from a cave in the base, and it was far more interesting. We left the glaciers and headed down to Lake Paringa, which was beautiful. I swam in the lake, which was actually pretty warm, surprising as the weather wasn't too great. We woke up the next morning with a bit of a mess in our tent. The water had started to seep through after a particularly wet night, and to make things worse, a possum had gotten to the porch of our tent due to some bread left in Frankie's bag. It had chewed a big hole in the bag and left us with not much bread and a lot of droppings all over our things. I have a new hatred for the vermin, and neither of us feel very guilty anymore about the flat ones we see on the side of the road. After a conservative breakfast, we left the campsite, past some spectacular views of the low clouds around the mountains and lakes, heading to Haast, the start of the Haast Pass, taking us through the Alps and off the west coast. A couple of nights in Haast to dry off the tent, and we were back on the road to get over. The ride up was fantastic. Some eerie views of the upcoming climb made us realise that this was going to be a tough one. Although it was a tough climb, we stopped to see a few waterfalls and we were treated some great views from the road. We stopped for the night at another dock, Cameron Flat, where we met a couple from Oz, Matt and Sashi, and Paul from Holland. The next morning we stopped at the Blue Pools, which were filled from the glaciers with swing bridges over the water. We decided to take a dip. Standing at the top, the bridge was a lot higher than I thought it was, but we decided to go for it anyway. The water was a lot colder than expected, so it was difficult to catch my breath swimming back. It certainly woke me up that morning. We continued on to Boundary Creek campsite, just towards the top of Lake Wanaka. The campsite was almost like its own little island out on the lake. It was awesome. The whole ride down to Wanaka was gorgeous. Blue skies and views across the lake to the mountains that stretched as far as the eye could see. When we arrived at Wanaka, the first stop was a camping store, so we could get yet more replacement poles for the tent. The constant putting up and taking down has taken its toll, so I bought a few spares. Putting together the poles took a bit of time. I had to use my multi-tool to cut the pole to size, which took longer than using a saw. Then, using a piece of fishing line and a heavy needle, I threaded the sections back together. We stayed in Wanaka for a few days so we could climb Roy's Peak to see the views of the lake, the town and the mountain ranges. We also went for an ice cream at Black Peak. I had a scoop of Malteser and a scoop of panna cotta. It was so tasty and super creamy.
We also stopped for pie time. First up is the vegetarian pie from the Dobin Bakery in Wanaka. 5 months in, it was time for my first New Zealand pie. Yes, it did take 5 months to find a vegetarian pie. Quite exciting times. It contained vegetables. Broccoli, cauliflower, carrot, swede and pumpkin in a creamy pumpkin sauce. I didn't realise it was pumpkin sauce until I read the ingredients after. I just thought it was a not very cheesy cheese sauce, like a plain roux. The pastry was flaky on top and held the filling well. I feel like vegetables can only be so exciting, so having sunflower seeds baked onto the pie lid was a nice touch, making the veggie option feel like less of an afterthought. This pie won a gold medal for being New Zealand's best veggie pie, and it would get the same accolade from me because it has no competition.
Second up is the venison pie, also from the Dobin Bakery in Wanaka. A nice crisp crust with really rich, gamey gravy and big succulent chunks of venison. It was one of the best fillings so far and I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Pie time.
We stayed in Wanaka for a lot longer than expected due to a sudden case of IT band syndrome, which caused me a lot of pain. After a few days of resting and stretching, we were ready to leave. Heading over the Crown Range, the highest sealed road in New Zealand. The first leg was pretty easy, a slow gradual climb, stopping by a fence with hundreds of bars attached, and the small town of Cardrona, with its old style buildings. The last 2 kilometres went up another 200 metres, so it was a hard slog to the peak. We finally made it, 1,076 metres above sea level. The view down towards Queenstown was spectacular, and the ride down the Crown Range was awesome. I picked up some good speed hurtling down the range. There were a few tight hairpins towards the bottom, which were pretty fun to go around. We then cycled into Arrowtown, which was full on autumn. The colours of the trees were spectacular. The next day we didn't have far to go, so we spent the morning walking around Arrowtown, a cool little place with old buildings and a Chinese village with huts that the miners used to live in back when there was gold in them there hills. We left Arrowtown and headed on to Queenstown. Everyone we'd met on our trip had warned us how busy Queenstown was, but when we got there we found it no busier than any city in the UK. I guess for New Zealand it's busy, but not for us. We spent a few days exploring and walking along the lakefront. The next episode will take us out of the Otago region and into the Southland, so hope you can join me next time. As always, I have a Patreon account, so please click on the link in the bio to help me produce some more great content. And also subscribe to the YouTube channel if you have yet to do so. Thanks.